Oh, you're, yes. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I'm just doing a quick head count here. We'll start now and hope that some other people drift in. You know, the topic today is a tough one for me. And I hope, to some extent, it's a tough one for all of us. That may be one of the reasons that more people signed up than showed up.
They're swimming.
Dealing with the issue of, I'm going to call it systemic racism, and not just ordinary racism as such, but systemic. In other words, something fundamental in the society is something we all resist. Can you all hear this? It's echoing for me. Something at least I've resisted. I wanted to say it's something else, and we'll come to that in a second. But I thought in order to get started, it would be good to set the mood, as it were. My wife, Sally Ann, who's normally acting as Vanna White and carrying the microphone back and forth, thank you, Jenny, wrote a poem for Legacy that is apropos, I think, to this conversation today. And so I've asked her to open the meeting, if that's all right with everyone.
Yeah.
And by the way, if it's not all right, suffer. Sally Ann, you're on.
We always love Sally Ann.
Don't throw rocks at me in the forest. Well, inspired by many events of recent times, this is a poem that I've written, and I'd like to start with a quote of Martin Luther King, who so wisely said, "Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter." My poem is called At Last. A crisp black uniform, starched collar and cuffs, snow-white apron trimmed in delicate eyelet lace. A worn hand etched in pain, outstretched, holding tightly to a silver tray, reflecting sparkling crystal chandeliers and soft candlelight, filled with tiny, delicious morsels, passed with quiet dignity. Is this a water chestnut? Yes, ma'am. Wrapped in bacon? Yes, ma'am. Eyes never meet. A living, breathing human being behind the tray. Never seen. Never seen. Dinner is served. Glasses tinkle and ring to announce joy-filled toasts, roasts, and boasts. Baked Alaska is ignited, along with intense feelings. Bubbling champagne is popped and poured. The music plays. In the mood, Chattanooga choo-choo, a string of pearls. Lester Lannon works his magic, and dancing begins. Elegant dresses sweep the floor, leaving a broken strand of pearls and sparkling sequins to be swept up later. Pampered and giddy debutante laughter fills the air. The last dance is announced. Lannon hats thrown up high. The song, At Last, is played. The party is over. She goes out into the night, unseen, humming the last song, never seen. The black uniform is put away for ironing, the apron to be washed. She kisses her little ones asleep in their beds, then soaks her chiseled, callous feet in warm Epsom salts. She walks wearily toward an empty bed, once occupied by the father of her little ones. Listen very closely. Silence speaks resoundingly. Learn early in life to read between the lines, for the lines and words never tell the whole story. Chaos, confusion, and conflict are always born in the agonizing absence of communion, when humans are unseen, never seen. On that night many decades ago, alone on her cracked and hardened knees beside the empty bed, she rested her head on the sheets, moistened by her falling tears, and prayed herself to sleep. Dear God, all I ask is that one day my precious children may be seen, at last, at long last.
Amen.
Well, you know, the topic came up as we were listening to news and talked about it a little bit over the last 2 or 3 weeks. Concepts like wokeism, cancel culture, critical race theory. And I thought before we talked about those subjects as such, I'd try to lay the groundwork by talking about what this is about. There are these issues, but then there are some facts that stand alongside those issues that I think are very important to understand. The subject of systemic racism or inequality in this country is not just a topic for casual conversation. There's a reality there, and it's that reality that forces us, I think appropriately, to grapple with the more difficult subjects. I won't go through all of these things verbatim. I sent out most of this PowerPoint. It's one of the files that I sent to you. You may have had a chance to look at some of these things before. But some of these items are not the normal things I think about, you know, income inequality versus some of these other. Half the black people with a college degree have had a family member in jail or prison. Think about that. Sally Ann and I went to a function last night to talk about the prison system here and the death penalty. And one of the speakers was from a group called Operation New Hope, which deals with re-entry and ways to try to assimilate the prison population back into the community when they complete their terms. And what came across in that was this extraordinary message about our system of incarceration. We put more people in prison in this country than any other country in the world. And they stay there longer. And they go back more frequently. It's just a tragic situation. But the idea that half of the college graduates, and I have to assume it's worse than that for those who didn't go to college, half of them have a family member in prison, that's just mind-boggling to me. 1 in 3 born in 2001 will spend time in prison in their lifetime. It's not just somebody else in their family. 1/3 of the black people in this country will spend time in prison. And the share of those going to prison is wildly disproportionate to their share of the population, as this data shows, comparing whites, blacks. Interestingly enough, and this is something that saddens me almost as much as the situation with African Americans, is that Hispanics are moving so rapidly into the same racially disparate category. And I think it was Forrest or somebody who mentioned last week, if we added Native Americans to this list, it'd even be a more dismal statistic. One of the things that I think is extraordinary about our system of incarceration is it doesn't end with prison. When you get out of prison or end your stint in behind bars, you're still supervised by the judicial system. You still have a correction officer in your life. Nearly 10% of black adults in this country are under that system of control. 1 in 1,000 black men will die at the hands of police. That seems like a lot of people who don't die, right? But it's extraordinary when compared to the data for other racial groups. You know, whenever there's another crime, another black person is killed by the police, I keep saying they're just beating that drum, and I'm so tired of that drum being beaten. Can't they find something else to report about? And then I stop and I think, God, it's still happening. How can it still be happening? Imprisonment of black males to whites, 12.7 times as likely if you're black and a teenager to be in prison than if you're white. You know, we say, well, that's because they're all druggies. Well, the data is pretty interesting. Black and white people, generally speaking, smoke just as much marijuana as the other racial group. The drug use is about the same across the races, but not the incarceration, not the arrests, which is wildly disproportionate. Fatal police shooting, as I mentioned the data earlier, again, it's radically disproportionate across the races. Changing from the criminal justice system, and I started there because it's one of those things we think about, at least in my case, I think about that less often than I do about the economy. But I think they're very linked. I think this run-ins with the justice system explains a great deal about unemployment, difficulty of finding employment, long lapses of unemployment. But the idea that a third of the black people have zero or negative net worth. I don't know if you've all heard the data point that I think the average person in this country has would struggle to find $400 in cash. Have you ever heard that data point before? You know, you think about that. I've been there, you know, times in my life. And I got to tell you, it's a scary place to be. And I've always known that I'd only be there briefly. That in a pinch I could always find somewhere, someplace, legally, to get $400 more. 1 in 3. A third of black children live in poverty. Comparing the median household wealth is just not one of those data points you ever want to see. The point behind all this, and I'll keep coming back to it, is this is a reality. This isn't just a fiction we make up, or that the racial minorities, make up. It's a reality. The poverty rate, covered by some of the solutions. 1.5 of black adults have accrued credit card debt during the past 3 months. Now, I didn't think I had black daughters, but periodically I wonder where in the world they get into the habit of incurring credit card debt. I keep saying, it's a license to steal. You should never owe money on a credit card. I'll add them to that group of people. But imagine half incurring credit card debt and paying as a result. What is it, 20% interest or some ridiculous number? It's a crazy way to fund life. Cutting back on size of meals. The data on black women is even more discouraging to me. We all know that women aren't paid a fair share, that's an issue that is long overdue. But that unevenness exists across both racial lines and sexual lines is extraordinary. 20% of black borrowers are turned down for loans. And this relates to the housing they have, and thus the schools they go to, the job opportunities they have, the grocery stores that are close to their homes, or they can borrow money for a loan, for housing. Overdrafted bank accounts. Again, I have to say, sure, guilty as charged. But that's it's an occurrence that happens, and it's always a mistake or a miscalculation on my part. It's not something that's characteristic of my lifestyle, but it is the lifestyle of so many people. Here's the $400 emergency expense issue again, although I've heard it for all people, not just blacks. Not able to pay the rent or mortgage relates again to where they are able to have a house. Employment data. Now, some of this data is skewed by COVID, but the relationships between blacks, whites, and Hispanics pertain across the COVID lines. In other words, yes, a lot of white people are out of work, a disproportionate number of black people and Hispanics are out of work. Health, and again, they're linked. Employment opportunities, justice system problems, and health. It goes together, so this shouldn't be a surprise. But I would never have guessed some of this data existed. Again, we come back to black children having a father in prison. It's so easy. I remember not very long ago saying the answer here is absent fathers. It's not about being black. Their fathers leave home. Well, a lot of them leave home and go to jail. And disproportionately so. Higher blood lead levels. Lack of health insurance. Black children suffering more from asthma. These are data points I was surprised to find as I was looking into the subject. Inability to find a doctor or go to the hospital because they can't afford it. I thought now that anybody could go to the emergency room at any time. And maybe the data point here has something to do with distance from hospitals or difficulty of getting there, I don't know. Difficulty filling prescriptions. Then you come back to just discriminatory action reported. More black students are suspended from schools than other racial groups, are disenfranchised than other racial groups, spend time in foster care. We've talked a little bit about education funding here, and there's a slide coming up about Florida and things we do better, but there's a hitch. The fact is that black students, the schools, public schools for black students, receive less money per capita than for white students. That's partly because they live in poor neighborhoods, but they live in poor neighborhoods for all those other reasons that cascade one on the other. They don't have the opportunity for AP classes, and AP classes that lead you to better college opportunities are important. This is a data point that I found really just this morning. Brown versus Board was 54, I think. 64. And yet today, we're still largely segregated. More than, 3/4 of the students in most schools are either white or black. It's never a fully integrated system. Now, I think we've talked about it here before. Someone here pointed out, I can't remember whom, but the data is accurate. Florida has done something I think pretty progressive in this area, but I said there's a hitch to it. Our state educational support system is skewed toward poverty alleviation. We pay more money per capita as a state to poor schools, or subsidize poor schools, than we do wealthy schools. You might think, well, duh, of course we do. But that wasn't the case forever, and it isn't the case in other states. But the interesting hitch to this is we're linking the need for support to income, not to race. And I'll come back to this point in a minute. One of the things that I read about was what they called in the thing color blindness. And I'll just recite a personal thing here. I studied government with Pat Moynihan, who later went on to be in the Nixon White House as a domestic policy advisor and then served in the Senate for many years. And he said at the time, this was 1968 was when he started serving for Nixon. I think he went to the Senate probably in 74, 76. It's not color, it's poverty. And I remember, wow, here's a very smart person who's been working on this for a long time, and he's got the answer. Part of the thinking over the last 50 years that is labeled sometimes colorblindness is, no, it's not about color. This is not a racial issue. It's a poverty issue. If we can give the same income level, the same education level to blacks as we do to whites, these differences, this inequality would disappear. And they call this liberalism, and I'll plead guilty. If we can just create equal opportunities, and we can recognize the individual, not focus on a racial group, and give everybody choice, we solve this problem. The truth is that has its difficulties. Or we say that preference, by the way, is preference. It's a typo. These people are not disadvantaged because of the system. They choose to live in those communities with poor schools. They choose not to work. They choose to be stopped by the police because they're black while they're driving. Or we say it's a cultural difference. You know, this happens to be a racial group that's pretty lazy or has a lot of teenage pregnancy. You hear it all the time. Or the fathers that abandon their mothers. It's just a racial thing. Fathers leave home. Or this notion that goes back to the Florida system. It's not race that's the factor we have to address, it's poverty. So let's go back to the terms that we talk about. What I'm trying to suggest with all this data, and I apologize for too many slides, death by PowerPoint, they're calling it, is that it's a real issue, not just a made-up issue. And why do we sometimes think it's made up? If you listen to some news outlets, they'll tell you wokeism, which is to be aware of and focus on racial difference, is made up. Because we're woke and concentrate on race, we don't see the joyous alternatives. And what I'm trying to say is that I think there are some issues with wokeism. We talk about them, but we can't ignore that big factual situation of racial difference. Cancel culture, which is linked to wokeism, is the form of ostracizing people who don't agree with us. And we usually think of cancel culture as people who are woke, who are aware of race, canceling out those who are not as being illiterate or deserving of shaming. But it goes both ways. You know, a person who is in denial about racial difference can cancel out others. It's as I say, a form of ostracism. What to do about wokeness, and this is the last slide. I think the only advice anybody can give is if you're woke, that is to say, aware of or attempting to be aware of the reality of racial difference, don't make a big deal out of that and try to shame others for not being as awakened as you are. Just be humble about it. Everyone makes mistakes. This morning I heard, and some of you may have heard the news this morning, state legislature in Colorado, somebody was coming toward the podium and says, "Wait a minute, Buckwheat. I haven't finished my thought." Surprise, surprise, the black woman who was coming to the podium was offended by that. Who was the guy running for Senate in Virginia not long ago who referred to an Indian American as Sambo or something like that? I can't remember. Or Pembo. No, it wasn't Pocahontas, but it was another, a slur, unfortunately. And do I think the guy should have been kicked in the ass for saying buckwheat? Yeah. But do I think that defines him as a racial bigot? No. It's a mistake. Cancel culture leaves little room for retribution or restitution, that a person can atone for mistakes they made. And that's another thing I think is, calling someone a racist isn't just a comment about a word they use, it's to question their character. And I think that's unfair, something we need to be careful about. And of course, there's this whole idea of I'm better than you are because I'm woke and you're not. Some thoughts about what to do. That's the end of the slideshow. The articles I sent out talked about wokeism and cancel culture. You've heard some of the data on racial inequality. Open for questions, comments. Ken, I'll let you go first, then we'll go to Bob Witter.
Thank you, Bob. One of the last points you made, I guess, I'm not sure who made it, was that it's not a matter of race, it's a matter of poverty. Was that the senator who said that, Monahan?
Moynihan had that view by the end of his career in the Senate.
That being the case, and that's an important place to start. When you show the per capita income difference between white and black, it really should be taken another step into the education level and the difference between educated white and black and educated, uneducated white and black, because that's where the poverty is. And by showing the numbers, maybe the higher level can focus more on the lower level. I mean, it gives them an incentive to grow from the that we need education is really maybe the real one of the answers to the whole issue. And as a general point, it wasn't one of your slides, but it was in the material you sent out, that we did reach, for whatever it's worth, the lowest level of black unemployment, I think, ever in 2019 before the pandemic. So there was progress being made, but I realized how the inequity is still there.
Thank you. I think valid points. Bob Witter? Jenny's got here with a distinguished hat.
The distinguished hat.
Trademark. I'm going to get one.
I have some of the same points, I suppose, as Ken. But education is a very significant factor in all of this, and the ability of blacks to catch up, because a large portion of them go to schools that are sub quality to whatever degree, sometimes very, very bad. And the other thing is that your data doesn't say anything at all about how we've made some progress in a lot of these areas that were covered over the last, 20 years, 30 years, whatever, like the time you want to go back. And we have made some progress. And even a lot of the blacks will admit that. You see them on television talking about these subjects. And so my point is, I don't know what we're going to do about education. My God, we've had how much money thrown into improving black lives in all of these programs. Didn't seem to make a whole lot of difference, but maybe it made a little, and maybe it got us a start. But it's a tough thing to have to deal with, and just pouring money at it rather than changing the educational system, for example, in a lot of the areas where we're woefully biased against, it turns out, blacks, because in the inner cities, where most of the blacks are, that's where lack of good education exists
That's a great
by and
statement.
large. If you go to a little country town or something like that, and you see black kids that are in, say, schools with 20,000 or less, you'll have much less of that. I remember very well a football player at Oregon State who was raised by white parents in Bend, Oregon. And so he had an education that was equivalent to whites. And so when he went to interact with his teammates, he said, I couldn't believe how relatively backward they were, because they came from inner cities and things like that, or Pahokee, Florida, or someplace like that. And it's a real shame, but those are the things that we need to focus on, and how we get teachers and facilities that will provide equivalent kinds of education for the blacks.
Good points.
We aren't going to make a
Charlie?
whole difference on this.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Bob. Charlie?
Please notice the table that I'm sitting at here. They almost refused to let me sit here. Just a quick comment, and then I have Bob, I haven't received material from you in the last 3 weeks or so. Have I been canceled?
Yeah, you're not woke. And,
Okay. The firm I worked for a number of years, Deloitte, was very progressive in this area, I felt. And for example, one of the things that I was involved in, I don't know how many of you remember Junior Achievement? Does that ring a bell? Okay, I was an advisor to Junior Achievement to a group of people, young high school students for a year, and a rather sharp group, but sort of fitting the profile that you've been talking about here. And it was very gratitude that I saw that one of them, the president, went on to become a star student in high school and college. I lost contact. A little bit later than that, I became a big brother. Are you familiar with that organization?
yeah.
And here I had a young person who had a family that was upset, and I spent about a year with him. I didn't have quite the same success, but for me it was a good experience. My point to this is that when I look at what we, the people, can do, I can't come up with any answer better than to talk about it. But individually, I feel good about the experiences that I had and that I believe made some difference. So I guess is it too late now for us to take a personal hand in some of the young people that might need some guidance?
Interesting question. Some ideas. Forrest? Sally, you wanna-
Hold on, Forrest, hold on.
Oh my, I'm outnumbered. I enjoyed your poem. I wish I could remember exactly what Martin Luther King said in the beginning that you used, but I think it's an awfully good one. It's probably one reason I'm talking right now. I'm not going to be silent, as you all know. I think a lot of things listening to you, Bob, and looking at your charts, which are pretty intensive. And all of you probably know I'm a Southerner by voice. You don't know that I lived in 6 Southern states as a child. And I've had racists in my family. My name, Forrest, was a famous Confederate general from Forrest County, Mississippi, which happens to be where Hattiesburg is. My grandmother was the first librarian there in southern Mississippi. So I feel like I'm a child of the South. I understand the South pretty thoroughly. The worst racism I've ever seen in my life was in Dearborn, Michigan, at a Ford plant when I was a co-op student, when I was a freshman at Georgia Tech. So I think I've seen racism in several flavors in my life, and I've been in 60 or so countries, and I've seen racism in a lot of places. I think one of the things that I get real hung up about wokeism and cancel culture and Joe Biden and Barack Obama, so that I'm not just a label of racist if I'm critical of Obama. I think he had one of the great opportunities that any president ever had here. But he failed miserably, in my opinion, and it didn't have anything to do with race, because he was a bright man. But I feel like that one of the real problems that we've got as a society today is we're driving through the rearview mirror and we're not looking through the windshield. I feel like that if you do that in your automobile, you're going to die, probably take some people with you. And I think as a nation, we're spending an awful lot of time worrying about what happened to the blacks when they came over here with black slavers. They weren't white people that originally created that problem. We obviously took advantage of it in the South in particular, but not just in the South. But I feel like that as a society, you can look at other minorities that have had it bad or worse than any issue that the blacks have ever dealt with in this society. The Jewish people have been tortured for years in multiple countries. I've personally been to Auschwitz, I've been to Birkenau, and I've seen what they did to Jewish people there. We know the death numbers. But Jewish people in this country excel in lots of things. The arts, the sciences, business. They represent about 8% of the country, is my understanding. As a group, they're very entrepreneurial, they're very family-oriented, they're very educationally oriented, and they're very successful. Asians have been locked up in this country because they're afraid that they would support Japan in the Second World War, which in many ways was a tragedy. But Asians are very successful in this country. They exceed whites in wealth and other income areas. One of the wealthiest income groups in America are people that came out of the Holocaust and moved to New York City. As a group, they're incredibly successful. So I feel like that we have crippled the blacks by talking about this stuff endlessly. And we haven't recognized that the man in the mirror matters too. And by golly, I think it's about time that we quit crippling them and assist them in ways that are meaningful rather than just try to pour money on problems that we were never solved the way we do it. And I get really just exhausted by the subject. I've had black friends all my life, including now. I'm on boards with them. I have them that serve me in nice restaurants around town, and I'm thrilled to see them, and I think they're thrilled to see me. But we are not being fair to blacks by acting like they're all crippled. They're not. And I understand there's a lady in our midst that I don't know, but taught Mac, who's on the staff here, to read. And he's an able black man and a friend of mine. But he's not feeling sorry for Mac, I can tell you that. I don't think we do anybody any good by just babying them. My kids paid for their own cars, even though I could easily afford it, because I thought it was important to them. And I had a toe strap. When they broke down, I'd go pull them back home. We got to get over this stuff and just be human beings. If we want to live together, or whites or blacks or yellow or purple, I don't care where we live, and I don't care who's next door to me. But we need to just forget all this nonsense of wokeism and cancel culture. It just drives me crazy. Thank you.
But I'm curious first, what do you really feel? Ted, back in the back. Thanks.
Well,
I'll come back to it.
You want to hold it? I mentioned this before at one of your meetings, but I think it bears repeating. I spent a lot of my life in Baltimore. I went to a school by the name of Baltimore Polytechnic Institute, which was a high school.
They had 4 different courses there. And if you took the A course, which was mostly engineering, after 4 years, you could enter the second year of any college in the country, including Cornell, which was then the top engineering college. I don't know where it stands now. I left Baltimore for probably 6 years, and when I came back, the same school had been closed, and it had been moved to a place where the Baltimore Country Club was, a very upscale neighborhood. 95% of the students at that time were black. They all took the A course. The teachers were Naval Academy graduates. So it can be done. And I can't tell you any more than that because I was away when this all happened. All I can tell you is the results were positive when I came back.
Good story. Sue?
Back in the 70s, I worked for an educational publisher that was bought by IBM, and I was director of the National Merit Scholarship qualifying test. And I think about it now, we had a separate program, the National Merit Scholarship Achievement Test for black students. How innocently we were racist. I don't know if it was perceived that way or not, but I think back on it now, and it certainly was making a distinction between white students and black students, assuming that they needed a less difficult test to take, and I also helped to write the test at one time in my past.
But was the purpose to denigrate the blacks or to give them an opportunity to excel?
It was to give them an opportunity to get scholarships for college. But I guess the presumption underneath that is that they needed help and couldn't qualify on the National Merit Scholarship test that was for white students and so forth.
I'd like to respond a little bit to that and to the other comments here. First of all, let me say, as I was doing the research for this presentation, for the materials that I sent out, I was just dismayed that it was still this situation. The data still looked like this. Because when I finished college in '68, my first job was to help enforce the equal employment opportunity regulation, something 22264, I forget now. We had sensitivity training at Boise Cascade. My partner in that was a black guy, and we gathered together these, Boise, Idaho white secretaries and have them touch Thad's curly black hair and all this kind of stuff. My wife then worked in a community action program in Johnson's Great Society, and that was 50 years ago, more than that. And I would have thought, if I could look in the windshield and not the rearview mirror, I would have thought for sure, half a century later, you never see data like this. In fact, one of the things, first of all, I'm tempted to move on because I too am kind of tired of the topic, but I'm tempted to go back to 1968 and 1970 and get comparable data and just see how much change, if any, there has been in this half century. And my really frightening kind of thought is that there hasn't been change. If anything, we've slipped sideways or backwards, although I've heard the comments that let's look at the progress. Forrest, do you want to respond to that? And then we've got another comment in the back too from Jenny.
Just a quick comment.
But we need the mic.
This will be very quick. A quick comment is simply this. I feel like that is a perfect indictment of government activity without any measurables.
I'm sorry, say it again.
It's a perfect testament to government activity without any accountability and without any measurements. And I think it seconds the thought I have that whatever we've been doing isn't working.
Well, I suspect what we're ever doing is not working, but I think that we had measurables. We were looking at exactly the same data we're looking at now of health and income and education,
A
and
lot of those are worse than they were in the 60s.
that's what scares me.
Because of governmental activity, in my opinion. And I have a good buddy of mine who lives in Sawgrass that was in Little Rock in '64 as a military person to allow the blacks to enter the school system. So it's been going on a long time.
And the fact that we've achieved so little, does that mean therefore that they're just different?
I think we
and not?
crippled the blacks by treating them like some peculiar people that were permanently disabled, and they're not. Many of them are very able. Most just like white people.
Jenny, did you have a comment back to back?
I just want to share some things. I had very good positive growing up with black people. And then I had a very special opportunity. My husband was transferred to Jamaica, and his company wisely gave me a 1-week course on prejudice and how to handle the way you thought about blacks before I went to Jamaica, so I would know and not use the wrong terminology or say the wrong things. One of the things that we have a tendency to do is refer to the black community or another cultural community as you people. You people means that they're not included in my people. We are all together. We are all citizens of the United States here. There is no such a thing as you people. That was something brought home to me. Another thing was, we have this, everything that you're all saying here, there it still comes down to the fact you must recognize we all have prejudices. And we cannot seem to get out of our minds the color of someone's skin. I had an Egyptian friend who came to college when I was a freshman. We're sitting around discussing things, and he said, I don't understand your obsession with the color of somebody's skin. He said, let me ask you a question. Do you know the color of the eyes of all your friends? Does that make a difference to you if they're blue-eyed or green-eyed or brown-eyed? Or do you even know what the color of their eyes are? But you sure can tell me what the color of their skin is. And it brought home to me the fact that yes, and I'm pleased to say that after living in Jamaica for 2 years, and most of my friends were blacks, although we didn't refer to each other that way, we referred to each other by complexion. I was light complected, but the longer I lived there, I kept getting darker. I can honestly say that I forgot what color skin my friends were. It had left me. I wish we all could reach that point so that we don't see this as a black person. We see it as one of us, as somebody that's a citizen here with us in the United States. Thank you.
Well said. Don Maley?
Jenny. Sorry.
You know, we're talking here about black and white, which seems to be a problem that distinguishes people one from the other. You might argue we're all black because we all came out of Africa originally. But if you look around this globe of ours, this kind of thing of differentiating between people is going on all over the place. not based on the color of their skin, but the church they go to, where they live. And I've worked for a Japanese company for a number of years. It was interesting how the people who lived in the city, Tokyo and Yokohama and so forth, looked down their nose at people who lived out in the country. And it's built, it seems to me, it's built into our psyche to take and separate ourselves from other people based on all sorts of factors. The color of our skin, the church we go to, the language we speak, the education we have, you name it. We normally do that. And so it seems to me that trying to undo this is a very difficult and maybe, I won't say impossible, never impossible I suppose, but very, very hard thing to accomplish. We can talk about it and hopefully it will go down some, and I think it has, at least in my lifetime. But it's got a long ways to go, and there are a lot of things involved with it that aren't necessarily the color of our skin.
Good points. Ken again?
Charlie made a good point before about how individuals can help, but I think in our group here, it's rather difficult at our age. But fortunately or not, we're going to depend on politicians to do a lot of things. And that hasn't always worked. I mean, the Great Society put a lot of money into this, and it hasn't solved the poverty problem yet. I mean, as you said earlier. Now, based on the charts you sent out, in the Congress, of the 535 members of Congress, in 20 years, it's got the combination of Black, Asian, and Native American have gone from 60 to 125. So, I mean, maybe that sounds slow, but it is a 100% increase.
Yeah.
And at some point in time, and you know, there's more people in different races running for Congress. I know of several where black guys ran against white guys, and the white guys won. So you can't always say that you just can't automatically make them get into Congress. They have to earn it. So, hopefully Congress, maybe with a more diverse Congress, things can improve, especially on education.
Well, the only person here that I think probably has a greater faith in the ability of Congress to solve the problem is Forrest. But that's a joke. Yeah, Bob, then I'm going to try to do a summation thing. Bob?
Could I just add one quick thing? I hope we're all aware that we are the subject of a very important ism, and that's ageism. And honestly, I think it's one of the most prevalent problems in our world today. Older people are often invisible, not seen. That poem that I wrote could easily have been about our age group. And we're not too old to do things. And I think we're not too old to make a difference. And to sort of piggyback on what Charlie said, I think if every individual did his little bit, you know, I mean, we may not be alive to see the difference, but perhaps our grandchildren will, because I believe the younger people are aware and awake to some of these problems, and perhaps we'll go to work on it. And the bigger problems are not going to be in our hands, but I want to point out that we are subjects of ageism, and yet we are strong individuals who still care. And we've got time.
Bob?
I lived in Yemen, Egypt, Bangladesh, and India. And one of the things that I saw was that even in the cities, there would be, you would come upon in a little neighborhood that there would be almost always a woman with a group of students around her, and they would be in school, just pick up school. I couldn't find any one that paid anything for this, but it must have been some kind of mechanism within these little mini cultures where that was important. Another thing was, there were always men around. And so I think that probably had some effect. And yet when you go to the garment factories, well, probably 90% of the employees in those garment factories are women. But I don't know how to distinguish all that. But it was very interesting that they weren't spending a lot of money for those educations.
Yeah.
They were actively involved in educating their own children in those little neighborhoods. And I'm sure, I don't have any data, but I'm sure that made a difference
No question.
in their culture.
And probably not a government program. Let me try to sum up with a couple things, if I may. First of all, I absolutely think that the key for us, particularly, is what Charlie said, which is to act as individuals in our own individual ways. And those acts can be as simple as seeing the other, whether the other is Asian, African, poor, Jewish. I'm discriminated against because I've got a very poor backhand. The bases for discrimination exist in so many different parts of our lives. Just seeing the other and recognizing them. And to the extent that there is anything like Big Brother or foster care, I think foster care is out for us, but volunteer activities might make some sense. The reason to have current events as an activity is to try to educate ourselves, to just get smarter about what's in the news. The reason this is a topic today isn't because it's been one of the things that I've been worried about for the last few months and thought, gee, I'll bring up one of my favorite topics. It's because wokeism and cancel culture are in the news every day. We'll have, I'm sure, some riots this summer to remind us again that there are some people who feel differently about this than we do. The more we are aware of what those differences are, what's making this noise, what's behind the noise, I think the better prepared we are, both to understand the news when we read it. I think it also helps to hear the comments of others. And I respect every one of you who said something about this today. I built housing in Mississippi years ago, and I have to say that in Picayune and Biloxi, I'm sure you have, the relationships between the races there were significantly better than they are in many northern cities. Just no question about it, okay? Though I think and I'm not altogether sure that I was about to say that the disparities in income, education, and health are just as great. I don't think they are. I think partly it's because they're not as urban as so many other cities. And I think the size and complexity of our urban areas leads to greater discrepancy between different groups of people. I don't think there are any easy answers to this. But I think we're going to be hearing about it until we're long gone. And so we're going to have to hear about it as echoes. I think it's good to pay more attention to it, but more importantly, to be educated about it so that when we see the news, we hear the words, we'll understand what they're about. So my advice to you all is to wake up and not judge others. Does that make any sense? Future meetings, it's now 11 o'clock, future meetings, I'm open to ideas. There are a couple people I've met that would like to come speak to us at some time. Janice reminded me that Buster Hagenbach, or Hagenbach, however you say it, who's chairman of the World Affairs Council here in Jacksonville, happens to be a close friend of Dale's, who works here, was at an event the other day, and he said he'd love to come talk to us a little bit about sort of the hot spots militarily around the world. Might be something interesting. Somebody here suggested that the legislator from our area, a Republican woman, I can't remember what her name is, goes to Tallahassee, but has expressed an interest in coming to talk to us. If any of you have any other ideas, I'm open to them. Between now and Sunday night, probably I'll not be able to sleep and come up with something to send you, except for Charlie. Thank you all.